I've recently consumed a great deal of material from various sources which claim that the Great Pyramid of Egypt may have actually been a power plant. I knew little about this idea prior to a survey of the material, but much of this material seems to suggest that Nikola Tesla was aware of this, strongly believed it, and may have based his work on this idea. A critical assessment of this hypothesis left me horrified. I started making videos to educate people about the nature of energy and to extricate Nikola Tesla from these kinds of outlandish conspiracy theories. They've associated him with many things like this to destroy his credibility, striking the poor man even in death as he was struck in life. Worse, in this hypothesis, they brought attention to the amazing work of Egyptologists who I admire while suggesting that they are liars, hiding the secret to change humanity into utopia in a veil of selfish secrecy. The size and scope of this idea's dissemination is terrifying. One can't help but notice the proliferation of videos by Christopher Dunn about his work on the Giza power plant. You have to sit through these videos to get to actual history documentaries anymore. I mean, the History Channel even made a segment about it. The entire internet is aflame with this work of one Christopher Dunn and the Giza power plant theory, and the more I look into this, the more upset I become. It offends me that they're attempting to associate Tesla with this, and to a lesser degree, that they're perpetrating this heinous hoax as a scientific achievement revealing evidence of hidden ancient technology or perhaps even aliens. I wish to debate this proposition. The first and most important thing to say is that in all of the reading I have done directly in the work of Nikola Tesla in his own writing, I have not found the place where he actually tells us that he believed the pyramids were power plants, and I'm willing to listen if someone has a verified reference to this statement because I've never seen it. Quite the opposite. Everything that I've ever read from Tesla doesn't deviate from his standard model of experimentation. He was an experimental inventor as well as a conceptual one. If he thought it up, he usually built and tested it. He didn't believe anything he couldn't prove. Now, one would think if he truly thought that the pyramids were power plants, he would have built one, or wrote about it, or even mentioned it on occasion. He built nothing even like them, and more so, he abandoned the idea of atmospheric transmission, which this idea is based on. I don't know if they did it to give credibility to their idea or to slander him. I find Nikola is often associated with these kinds of ideas to make sure that no one will take him seriously. The minute you mention his name, you get written off. It's a compliment, to be sure, about the power of the ideas he left with us, and perhaps a validation of them. Nikola once said, "I don't care that they stole my idea. I care that they don't have any of their own." Apropos, I think, especially now. I'm going to disprove each of the planks of the basic argument as I understand them, one by one. I'm going to address all of the claims I think are the best exemplars of the size of the disinformation being spread, and then offer proof, real proof provided to me by real scientists, Egyptologists. Number 1. Pyramid means fire in the middle. The first and most illustrative thing to address is the claim that pyramid means fire in the middle. I've heard this on almost every video I've ingested, and even on the Joe Rogan interview of Graham Hancock. This is the exact definition and model of the entire rest of the hypothesis in terms of the scope and type of disinformation. Pyramid comes from the ancient Greek word pyramus, which meant kind of cake of roasted wheat grains preserved in honey, and maybe had a similar shape. And in this sense, the word is ultimately said to derive from pyros, which is wheat. But the proposition that pyra can mean fire ultimately undoes the argument. Pyra is a Koine Greek word, meaning fire or a pile of fuel. But Koine Greek is not ancient Greek. It evolved from the spread of Greek following the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and it served as the lingua franca of much of the Mediterranean region in the Middle East during the following centuries. This is from circa the turn of the first millennia. This word is used in the New Testament. Mid is a Middle English or Germanic suffix. This prefix, pyra, attached to the Middle English or Germanic suffix mid to mean fire in the middle would therefore be anachronistic and geographically absurd. By verified etymology, the very idea that the word pyramid could even mean fire in the middle would require that the people who invented the word for use had some idea that the pyramids had fire in the middle. How would someone from the 1st century AD and someone from the Middle Ages Europe get together to discuss the Egyptian power plants from at least 2,000 years before either of them were born? The final nail in that coffin is that the usual ancient Egyptian word for pyramid is mer. In hieroglyphics, it's generally written with an owl and a mouth. It meant place of ascension. Where does the idea that it means fire in the middle come from? In his book, Technology of the Gods, Childress states that pyramid is Greek for fire in the center. He gives no sources or etymology. It is an unsubstantiated and logically insoluble argument made with no evidence for it at all. And all the evidence is actually against it, but they keep saying it like it's true, so people just keep accepting it uncritically. And this is what this plank in the argument has in common with the rest of it. 2. Are the pyramids actually tombs? So the speculation that the pyramids are power plants, before I address the individual pieces of the argument, first requires that you prove that the pyramids aren't tombs. The accepted narrative for a long time has been that the pyramids are tombs. And from the time modern society really started to show an interest in the ruins of ancient Egypt, they realized that there was an awful lot of writing on their monuments. Nobody had any idea how to read this writing, though, because it was in a dead language. Well, that was until the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, is a stela inscribed with 3 versions of a decree issued in Memphis, Egypt in 196 BC during the Ptolemaic dynasty, on behalf of King Ptolemy V Epiphanes. The top and middle texts are in ancient Egyptian using hieroglyphic and demotic scripts respectively, while the bottom is in ancient Greek. The decree only has minor differences between the 3 versions, making the Rosetta Stone key to deciphering the Egyptian scripts. We knew how to read ancient Greek just fine. Using this stela, linguist Jean-Francois Champollion managed to crack the code. He opened the door to reading this ancient script, and we did, and we still are, reading everything they ever wrote that still exists, and they wrote a lot. They wrote on walls, they wrote on papyrus, they wrote on shards of limestone, they wrote on pottery, and they wrote in their tombs. Mostly they wrote, "This is a tomb on the wall of tombs." They wrote instructions for dead people to get to the next world. They wrote about the life of the person whose preserved body was found a few feet away in a coffin with a mask on, looking exactly like the picture next to their name in hieroglyphics on the wall where it says this is a tomb. They also wrote things like the Palermo Stone. The Palermo Stone is one of 7 surviving fragments of a stela known as the Royal Annals of the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt. The stela contained a list of the kings of Egypt from the First Dynasty, circa 3150 to 2890 BCE, through to the early part of the Fifth Dynasty, circa 2392 to 2283 BCE. And it noted significant events in each year of their reigns. Now, this was the age of the origins of the pyramids as tombs. Attested here, among others, is Pharaoh Djoser and Pharaoh Senefru, both of which built pyramids. And we know this because their names are on them. Even their statues are there. Now, prior to Djoser's reign, mastaba tombs were the customary form for graves. These were rectangular monuments made of dried clay brick which covered underground passages where the deceased was entombed. For reasons which remain unclear, Djoser's vizier Imhotep, circa 2667 BCE, conceived of building a more impressive tomb for his king by stacking mastabas on top of one another, progressively making them smaller to form the shape now known as the Step Pyramid. It wasn't just a single building. Just like the Great Pyramid, it was a complex complete with altars, chapels, and mortuary temples. The complex was a landmark achievement for Egyptian architecture. It was the introduction of the pyramidal form of the royal tomb and the first instance of the mass use of limestone in construction, which replaced mud brick as the staple building material. No one would speculate that this was a power plant. Imhotep became a legend and even a god to the Egyptians. Imhotep's actual existence is confirmed by 2 contemporary inscriptions made during his lifetime on the base or pedestal of one of Djoser's statues, and also by a graffito on the enclosure wall surrounding Sekhemkhet's unfinished step pyramid. His legend was as prolific from then on as the legend of Chuck Norris. He was a genius, and he helped them through experimentation, which we have a record of in the building he created and everything that followed leading up to the Great Pyramid. There was a steady line of small evolutionary steps from this first pyramid to the Great Pyramid of Khufu, and they were all tombs. Imhotep's legend is quite well preserved in Egyptian history as it moved forward. He undoubtedly survived King Djoser, as Imhotep's name also occurs in the next royal complex, that of King Sekhemkhet in Saqqara. Saqqara, by the way, is a grand field of pyramid evolutionary evidence, and it's a funerary complex. It's a necropolis where they have found many mummies, because you put tombs in a graveyard. In Saqqara, for example, you'll find the Unas Pyramid, which is the smallest in Saqqara. Its main feature is the inscriptions of texts intended to help the pharaoh in the underworld. Because it's a tomb, the Pharaoh Senefru is credited with at least 3 of the pyramids himself. The greatest pyramid builder in the history of Egypt was not Khufu, the pharaoh to whom the Great Pyramid of Giza is owed. That title actually corresponds to his father Senefru, who, for the construction of the 3 pyramids that are attributed to him, used 40% more cubic meters of stone than his son Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Senefru was the first Egyptian pharaoh to build a perfect pyramid with smooth faces, and to develop the classical structure of Egyptian funerary complexes, which would last for several centuries. One of the more interesting of these tombs is the Medoum Pyramid, clearly demonstrating a transitional form to the Great Pyramid. It is unfinished and was obviously testing the limits of the pyramidal mastaba concept, and it was built by Senefru. Flinders Petrie was the first Egyptologist to establish the facts of its original design, dimensions, and proportions, In its final form, it was 1,100 cubits of 0.523 meters around by 175 cubits high, thus showing the same proportions as the Great Pyramid at Giza, and therefore the same circular symbolism. Petrie wrote in 1892 in his excavation report that, "We see then that there is an exactly analogous theory for the dimensions of Medum to that of the Great Pyramid. In each, the approximate ratio of 7 to 44 is adopted, as referred to the radius and circle. These proportions equated to the four outer faces sloping in by precisely 51.842 degrees, which would have been understood and expressed by the ancient Egyptians as a second slope of 5.5 palms. He also built a pyramid which they called the Bent Pyramid. They realized halfway through the construction that the darn thing would be too heavy and probably would collapse in on itself if they kept building it at the same angle they started, so they made it shallower. Now, this may be important later when talking about the purpose of a large granite structure meant to relieve pressure in future pyramids. However, one might say that Seneferu's greatest achievement was the final try in his construction efforts, the Red Pyramid. The Red Pyramid was the third pyramid built by Old Kingdom Pharaoh Seneferu. The Red Pyramid, also called the North Pyramid, is the largest of the pyramids located at the Dashur necropolis in Cairo, Egypt. It is named for the rusty reddish hue of its red limestone innards, and it is also the third largest Egyptian pyramid after those of Khufu and Khafre at Giza. It is believed to be Egypt's first successful attempt at constructing a true smooth-sided pyramid, and when it was finished, it was covered in Tura limestone. So, we show an unbroken line of the building of what are obviously tombs with funerary complexes across many reigns leading up to the building of the largest of these monuments by the son of the most prodigious pyramid builder in recorded Egyptian history. It was surrounded by cemeteries, had a mortuary temple just like the line of unbroken small steps leading up to it, and even had an entire boat broken down and buried next to it so the pharaoh could use it in his afterlife. Who buries a boat at a power plant? Could the pyramids have been built by an older, super advanced civilization? So, owing to the fact that we have such documentation of the history, development, and evolution of the design of the pyramids and their purpose, we can also throw out the idea that the Pyramid of Khufu might have been built by an older civilization. Not only is it entirely possible for the Egyptians to have done it, for the reasons I will explain, but it is unnecessary for an older civilization to even be postulated. The claim that the pyramid was built by an older civilization is a badly formed hypothesis. It is unfalsifiable because none of our ancestors, all of these being unaware of this theory, has ever written anything saying this pyramid wasn't a power plant built by an older civilization. Again, as before, we can look to the tireless work of Egyptologists for a very strong argument against this proposition. First of all, there are two pyramids just like the one Khufu built right beside it. That strongly dissuades one from thinking that it was built by another people. Next, and I think most importantly, we know the very hands that knocked it together. We know where they lived and where they worked and even what their names were from evidence sometimes written by those hands. The pyramids were built by Egyptians, by stonemasons, artisans, artists, and craftsmen. And while skilled craftsmen and management staff worked year-round, farmers would come from the provinces during the inundation period to do the heavy work. Archaeologists and experts are uncovering, even right now, the very village in which these people lived. Excavations at Giza have taken place less than 1,000 feet south of the Great Sphinx. To build and maintain the pyramids, an enormous support system must have existed. Production facilities for food, pottery, building materials, supplies, and storage depots should be expected and have been found. There's also been excavated housing for the workmen and those responsible for servicing the pyramid temples. Evidence of a sewage system was uncovered too. The oldest known paved street with drainage facilities and the oldest known hypostyle hall have been found here. Since the reign of Seneferu, an entire town was associated with each pyramid, full of people employed to maintain the king's afterlife. New villages and agricultural estates were founded specifically to supply the pyramid cult and those who worked for it. This flow of resources from the peripheries to the pyramids and thus to the very center of the state was responsible for making Egypt into the most powerful centralized nation of its time. It's also still mostly there to dig up and look at. From hieroglyphics, inscriptions, and graffiti, it is being learned that skilled builders and craftsmen probably worked year-round at the site. They built their tombs near the pyramids and have placed statues and other objects inside in preparation for the afterlife. The mud brick tombs had a variety of shapes: mini pyramids, step pyramids, mastabas, and even beehives. The tombs of the pyramid builders were actually found when a tourist's horse stumbled and punctured what turned out to be the intact, vaulted roof of a tomb. A tomb with lots and lots of writing, and guess what that writing said? Analysis of skeletal remains in these tombs shows the average age of death was between 30 and 35 years. Bones of both men and women show evidence of heavy labor. Degenerative arthritis occurred in the vertebral column, particularly in the lumbar region and in the knees. And this is what one might expect from people who moved several ton stones all day. In a Nova article entitled "Who Built the Pyramids?", Mark Lehner, archaeologist, Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago and Harvard Semitic Museum, was asked to explain evidence that the Egyptians built the pyramids. And he responded, "One of the most compelling pieces of evidence we have is graffiti on ancient stone monuments in places that they didn't mean to be shown. Like on foundations, when we dig down below the floor level, up in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, and in many monuments of the Old Kingdom temples, the Sun Temples, other pyramids. Well, the graffiti gives us a picture of organization where a gang of workmen was organized into 2 crews. And the crews were subdivided into 5 files. The word files is spelled P-H-Y-L-E-S. It's a Greek word for tribe. The Egyptian word is za. They were divided into 5 zas. And in later times, when the Greeks came and in bilingual inscriptions, when somebody was translating za into Greek, they used the word files, the word for tribe, which is extremely interesting, actually. Were these militaristic kinds of conscripts? Well, certainly they weren't slaves. Could they have actually been natural communities of the Nile Valley kind of contributing, like the way the Inca build their bridges and so on? So the files then are subdivided into divisions, and the divisions are identified by single hieroglyphs with names that mean things like endurance, perfection, strong. Okay, so how do we know this? You come to a block of stone in the relieving chamber above the Great Pyramid. And first of all, you see this cartouche of a king, and then some scrawls all in red paint after it. That's the gang name. And in the Old Kingdom, in the time of the pyramids of Giza, the gangs were named after kings. So, for example, we have a name compounded with the name of Menkaure, and it seems to translate the drunks or the drunkards of Menkaure. And there's one that's well attested, actually, in the relieving chambers above the Great Pyramid. The Friends of Khufu gang, the Drunks of Menkaure gang, and then you have the Green Files, and then the Powerful ones. I know this sounds like slavery, does it? In fact, it gets more intriguing, because in certain monuments you find the name of one gang on one side of the monument and another gang we assume competing on the other side of the monument. You find that to some extent in the temple, the Pyramid Temple of Menkaure, it's as though these gangs are competing. So from this evidence we deduce that there was a labor force, and that was assigned to respective crew gang files and division. Zahi Hawass was also asked in this interview, who built the pyramids? And he responded similarly, putting a very fine point on this. He said, "We are lucky because we found this whole evidence of the workmen who built the pyramids, and we found the artisans, and Mark found the bakery, and we found the settlement of the camp, and all the evidence. The hieroglyphical inscriptions of the overseer of the site of the pyramid, the overseer of the west side of the pyramid, the craftsman we found, the man who makes the statue of the overseer of the craftsman, the inspector of building tombs, director of building tombs. I'm telling you all the titles. We found 25 unique new titles connected with these people. Then who built the pyramids? It was the Egyptians who built the pyramids. The Great Pyramid is dated, with all the evidence, I'm telling you now, to 4,600 years, the reign of Khufu. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is one of 104 pyramids in Egypt with superstructure, and there are 54 pyramids with substructure. There is support that the builders of the pyramids were Egyptians. They are not the Jews, as has been said. They are not people from a lost civilization. They are not out of space. They are Egyptian, and their skeletons are here, and were examined by scholars, doctors, and the race of all the people we found are completely supporting that they are Egyptians. To believe that anyone but Egyptians built the pyramids would require overlooking such an immense amount of evidence that it is akin to denying the evidence of your own eyes. It could be literally denying such evidence because you can go and verify these things for yourself. You could see photos. You could even try and translate the inscriptions yourself. They're available. The idea that the pyramids were built by an ancient civilization is only supported by the conjecture of people who wrote books to sell those books. 4. Were the pyramid stones actually moved with acoustic resonance? So even if we know who built it, how did they build it? It must have required an exceptional technology surely lost to the ages, right? I heard Graham Hancock suggest that the pyramid stones were moved by resonant acoustics and levitated using advanced sound techniques. Such elegant solutions are of course not required. In fact, this fellow would beg to differ. He built a Stonehenge in his backyard. Ed Leeds Callinan may not have documented, but this fellow did. And there are videos aplenty of his work showing that acoustic resonant anti-gravity was not necessary at all to move these stones. You can research him yourself if you like. His name is Wally Wallington. Now here's what he managed to do, and the proof is in the Stonehenge in his yard. One man did this in plain view by himself and recorded it to prove he could. The acoustic resonant levitation speculation is utterly unsupported by even a single shred of evidence. We have never found one ancient speaker, nor an ancient amplifier or frequency generator. It didn't need all that. It only required practice and ingenuity, just experience and the right clever techniques. Now, you'd be surprised how easy it is to move a ton of stone with just one man. Now imagine using his techniques, or even better ones, with 30,000 skilled workers who'd been doing it for centuries. 5. How did they get the stone to the pyramids without levitation? David Bresson tells us in his article titled, "Papyrus Reveals from Where the Rocks Used to Build the Great Pyramid Came From." The granite used in the Great Pyramid was transported over 500 miles to the construction site. The white limestone used for the outer sides of the pyramid is found on the other shore of the Nile. The blocks usually range from 2 to 3 tons in weight. It seems almost an impossible task to move the blocks without heavy equipment, and some authors argued that ancient aliens helped in the construction, but the truth is, ancient Egyptians were able to solve this problem with their characteristic intelligence and ingenuity. A discovery made in 2013 seems to explain this. In a cave 410 miles away from Giza, on a 4,600-year-old papyrus scroll, archaeologists found a written letter or report referring to a shipload of rocks probably used for Khufu's pyramid. The papyrus, addressed to Ankaf Khufu's brother, describes the expedition of a 200-man crew to the limestone quarries near Tura on the eastern shore of the Nile. After loading the blocks onto their ship, the expedition followed for 10 miles the River Nile, and also the Aswan granite and other rocks used for construction were always quarried near the Nile or near larger bodies of water like lakes or the Red Sea. Unloaded in the harbor associated with the construction site, the blocks were pulled up on ramps and sledges into the Giza Plateau. The papyrus not only confirms the geological research done tracking the rock types used in the construction of the Great Pyramid to certain quarries, but also explains how ancient Egyptians managed to transport the blocks even without the help of aliens. Further, this was only one of the many papyri discovered in 2013. The diary of an overseer uncovered in the seaport of Wadi al-Jafar appears to answer the age-old question, showing the ancient Egyptians harnessed the power of the Nile to transport the giant blocks of stone. The overseer's name was Merer, interesting name for someone who worked on Mer. More interesting is that archaeologists uncovered a ceremonial boat and a system of waterworks. The ancient text described how Merer's team dug huge canals to channel the water of the Nile to the pyramid. Archaeologist Mark Lehner, who has devoted his career to uncovering who built the pyramids, explained how his team had uncovered a waterway hidden beneath the Giza Plateau. It is believed that the stones which went into the pyramid were delivered to this area. So we have a clear line of history showing the steps, writings in the hand of those who actually did the work, moving the materials the thing was built of, and physical proof of their existence. Now let's get into the tin hat nitty-gritty. 6. Isn't the king's chamber some kind of resonator? Of all the claims I've heard done in Hancock make, this is the easiest to disprove with direct measurement and math. The king's chamber is not a resonator, it's a tomb. That tomb is protected by a chamber meant to relieve the pressure of a lot of rock bearing down on it to protect the pharaoh from the destruction of his body, which he needs if he wants to live forever. If we look at a diagram of a few pyramids side by side, we can see that there were relieving chambers built into many of them. And the reason? The rocks are heavy. When you build an arch, you place a keystone. The keystone is placed last when constructing an arch, locking all the other stones into place. It allows the arch to bear its own weight. And you'll notice that a keystone is slanted or sloped to distribute the weight more efficiently, just like the relieving chambers. If you don't build a relieving chamber, your pyramid might get bent, or just collapse in on itself. Either way, you will notice by cross-section that from the Medun pyramid on up to the pyramid of Khufu, they used relieving chambers just like keystones. The pyramid of Khufu had the most elaborate one, but certainly they were a feature of Seneferu's line and his son's monument. The clear evolution of the designs certainly seems to suggest that Khufu was, however, the pinnacle of the pharaonic pyramid enthusiast set. The one claim I simply can't abide, however, is that the king's chamber or the sarcophagus resonated at 440 hertz or an F-sharp chord. I've heard both claims from Dunn and from others repeating his work in various combinations of those claims, but this is mathematically disprovable quite easily. The first thing we do is calculate, given known dimensions, the resonant frequency of the chamber. We know the speed of sound, we know the length of the waves of various frequencies, so figuring the resonant frequency of a closed space is really just simple algebra. This is a list of the resonant frequency and harmonics of the King's Chamber, which is calculated to be considerably less than 440 Hz even at its peak, and which is at least a factor of 4 less than 440. If you want experimental verification, no problem. Andrew Collins measured them in 2019 and gave us a spectrum analysis. This intrepid and science-minded individual gives us a spectrogram of the dominant frequencies in the King's Chamber that he collected meticulously in person. You'll notice that they vary only slightly from the pure math. This is to be expected because there's a big coffin in the middle of the room which skews the dynamics slightly. He tells us that the largest amplitude sound frequency recorded in the King's Chamber was at 49.5 Hz. Tracks perfectly. Significant spikes of activity also occurred at 30.5 Hz and 33 Hz. Check and check. With a cluster of peaks between 30 Hz and 130 Hz. Now, this is exactly what the math predicted and is experimentally verified. No F-sharp chord either. The notes are there, but that's because in the harmonics, the entire scale with accidentals is included. That's sort of like betting someone you can guess their name and then writing out the whole alphabet and saying, you guessed it because it's in there somewhere. By the way, the sarcophagus isn't a resonator either. It is a fact that it is a sarcophagus. We know this because there are many, many like it in many, many other tombs in Egypt. Many of them pyramids, and many of them contained bodies in them. Let's even say it was a resonator. A guitar string plays at the frequency it does because of its length. The equation's easy. The note it plays is its resonant frequency. You can raise or lower it by changing the tension, i.e. tuning. You can change the pitch entirely by simply changing the length, i.e. pressing down one of the strings on a fret. If you alter the physical structure of any resonator, you change its resonant frequency. The sarcophagus is severely damaged. It would not resonate at any frequency it was supposedly supposed to or had been designed to when it was built because it is so damaged. So whatever frequency he says it resonates at is meaningless. It's severely damaged. The system is compromised. The frequency it would resonate at now, even if it was a resonator, is grossly different from what it was imaginarily built to be, and therefore would prove absolutely nothing. The frequency it plays at now would therefore be entirely irrelevant for figuring out its purpose. Next question. Why granite? So why was the King's Chamber made of granite? Doesn't granite contain quartz and therefore resonate or produce piezoelectricity under pressure and vibrate? The idea that the King's Chamber was somehow an electromagnetic resonator or sonic resonator is entirely unnecessary to explain why it was made of granite. First of all, granite's not a conductor. No one uses granite to make wires. No one uses granite circuits in their computers. Granite is an insulator. Granite is also exceedingly dense. In fact, its compressibility is much, much lower than that of limestone used in the bulk of the pyramid. It would make sense if you were trying to put an open space in the middle of the biggest pile of limestone in human history to that point, that you would use a super hard rock like granite to distribute the weight. The idea of it being a cavity resonator perhaps stems from a reasoning by analogy, which is the kind of slipshod thinking science is meant to replace. Does it look like a magnetron? Yes. Has it ever produced microwave frequency EM radiation? No, because granite is not a conductor, and even pure quartz doesn't act that way under pressure. The pyramid weight is in equilibrium and therefore does not move. Piezoelectricity works because of the applied force transferring energy to it, which converts into electrical energy. First, it requires motion. Second, it would require a path for the current or even just charge accumulation, which granite will not provide. Granite is an insulator. Even in an earthquake, no electricity would be produced. Electrical current does not flow in the pyramid, nor would it. The pyramid is made of stone, and stone is an insulator. Radio frequencies don't like to travel through stone either. Go use your cell phone in a tunnel under a mountain to call me if you disagree. 7. But aren't the pyramids resonators that have been scientifically proven to focus radio frequency electromagnetic energy? In the paper Electromagnetic Properties of the Great Pyramid, First Multipole Resonances and Energy Concentration by Russian scientists at ITMO, there is an infographic which Christopher Dunn uses in his videos. He uses this to attempt to prove that pyramids do in fact concentrate energy fed into them. You need to read the graph very carefully and maybe look into the paper, because the method is to simulate the bombardment of the pyramid from above as a solid piece of limestone by radio waves at wavelengths from 200 to 600 meters. The radio waves in the model, and it is a mathematical model, not an experimental verification, would have to come at the pyramid as described from above and at industrial magnitude to affect it. This only proves that if you had a huge radio emitter dish twice the diameter of the pyramid perched above it, putting out powerful radio waves, you'd end up focusing them in an area under the pyramid and possibly inside it. Now look here. There are the waves. It is unlikely such a device is practical, as it would take an awful lot of energy to keep in the air and even more to broadcast a powerful radio signal over many acres. And this is why the scientists plan to use the results to reproduce similar effects at the nanoscale. Choosing a material with suitable electromagnetic properties, they say, we can obtain pyramidal nanoparticles with a promise for practical application in nanosensors and effective solar cells. That's a quote from Polina Kapitanova, PhD, a member of the Faculty of Physics and Technology at ITMO University. This study wasn't meant to prove how to make the pyramids into power plants. He grossly misreads the infographic he uses and most likely has no idea what is actually in the paper. It is flashy and it really looks like something that proves his point, but in reality this demonstrates the incredible unfeasibility of his idea. The amount of applied energy here would be profound if they actually did it, and it would likely cook some tourists. Fortunately, they just simulated it. Now the part I don't get is that they suggest that the King's Chamber would concentrate these energies in the paper, but where they've put the King's Chamber in each of these pyramids, it's black, and black on the legend means zero energy, electrical or magnetic. If it was just superimposed, that means they ran the simulation without including the King's Chamber, so why did they mention it in the first place? It was very troubling. It's almost like they were trying to grab some sensational attention for their work by associating an easily misinterpreted conceptual experiment with a famous monument everyone's curious about. That is going around. 8. But wasn't the Queen's Chamber a reaction chamber that made hydrogen, which was fed to the King's Chamber? Doesn't the presence of gypsum and salt in the shafts confirm this? In a word, no. Neither of these things is strange at all, and none of them indicate the presence of either dilute hydrochloric acid or zinc chloride. The mortar used in the Great Pyramid was actually composed of gypsum, and they used a lot of it. The ancient Egyptians used this for both mortar and some plasters, and the walls may have once been covered in painted gypsum plaster, just like in many other tombs which has either been removed or destroyed. Also, with the number of visitors the pyramids have had over the years, the poor ventilation, the simple human breath, these things would deposit enough salt through moisture to collect over, say, several hundred years. But if that isn't sufficient to explain the salt, there's a much more obvious answer. Efflorescence. Efflorescence is a whitish crystalline deposit that manifests on the surface of limestone. Limestone is made of calcium carbonate largely. That means it's basically made of seashells, and the most prominent feature of seawater, chemically, is salt. It doesn't rain much on the pyramids, but there have been rains and some floods, and it is possible that they flooded, and that much water would be more than sufficient to leach a crust of salt from the limestone as the water evaporated. This phenomena is so common that they have companies which actually specialize in restoring salt-crusted and salt-damaged limestone. Yes, the salt can damage it, causing voids in the structure of the limestone as it leaches out, leaving it to look pitted or eroded. So this not only explains the presence of the salt, but predicts erosion and pitting, just like in the shafts where Dunn suggests this erosion is from a large flow of hydrochloric acid. Now, how can you possibly say that after many thousands of years, you can detect trace amounts of a chemical like that and guarantee its attribution to this theory, when there are so many simpler explanations supported by basic knowledge of other similar structures next door? That's a bit circular, don't you think? Before we even address the speculation that such a thing happened or that evidence of it exists in the Great Pyramid, you have to answer two questions. First, is there any evidence of the manufacture of concentrated hydrochloric acid in Egyptian history? Hydrochloric acid is produced in the United States primarily by 4 basic methods: the chlorination of organic chemicals, the combination of hydrogen and chlorine, the salt sulfuric acid production process, and as a co-product in the manufacture of silica. This chemical isn't really easy to make in industrial quantities. It takes specialized manufacturing facilities, which takes lots of energy and lots of equipment. And there's no evidence of any of these facilities in ancient Egypt. Although they did have a knowledge of chemistry, they didn't have that kind of knowledge. And that really answers the second question: is there evidence of zinc chloride production? Because concentrated hydrochloric acid is one of the necessary components of zinc chloride. Now, where did they get all the chemicals, and where would they have gotten the energy to make them? Where is the evidence of PPE used to protect them from the incredibly potent and caustic substance, hydrochloric acid? And how did they transport industrial amounts of it? This is an exceptional claim which can be dismissed without exceptional evidence. There is absolutely zero evidence for this part of the hypothesis, which cannot be easily addressed by the very simple explanations which do not require an ancient civilization or the addition of extraterrestrial technologies. 9. But what about the smell? Doesn't this prove chemical reactants were present? I have heard some anecdotal tellings of the profound odor of the pyramid: ammonia, urine, and mold. This does not prove that two caustic chemicals were produced in industrial amounts and mixed to create hydrogen for an energetic maser beam. The air in the pyramids does not transit easily because there are a lot of openings and it's in a desert. And perhaps that's why there are air shafts. It's a simple explanation, but I have often wondered how in a closed space where fire was the light source and a gang of workers was laboring their hearts out, they didn't just run out of oxygen from the lack of air transit. But that seems to be a lot of lung for a very small amount of space. However, at this point, the pyramid has been still described as hot and stuffy without some kind of fan to move the air. Now add to that the toileting habits of thieves. The first people into the pyramids after they were opened were not archaeologists, they were looters. It took a long time to dig their way in and probably took a great deal of time to explore, especially by torchlight. Would they crawl back out every time they had to use the bathroom? Looters aren't known for their courtesy. Why does it smell like urine? Possibly because people urinated in it. And there have been generations of visitors across hundreds of years coming and going from the pyramid, leaving trash, food refuse, and various other things that create profound smells. It is unlikely that if in fact there were chemicals mixed there, that you could smell them over the olfactory cacophony created by rude tourists of antiquity. 10. But isn't there evidence of an explosion indicating hydrogen may have been present and overreacted? Of course there is evidence of an explosion. There was at least one explosion right in the king's chamber. You don't even have to go farther than the wiki to find that. The wiki for the Great Pyramid explains this in the subsection about the relieving chambers. It says, Nathaniel Davison is credited with the discovery of the lowest of these chambers in 1763, although a French merchant named Maynard informed him of its existence. It can be reached through an ancient passage that originates from the top of the south wall of the Grand Gallery. The upper four chambers were discovered in 1837 by Howard Weiss after discovering a crack in the ceiling of the first chamber. This allowed the insertion of a long reed which, with the employment of gunpowder and boring rods, forced a tunnel upwards through the masonry. As no access shafts existed for the upper four chambers, unlike Davison's chamber, they were completely inaccessible until this point. Boom. 11. Couldn't the Earth be a source of energy which made the pyramid resonate? The pyramids resonate at the frequency of the Earth, don't they? F sharp and the infrasound between 2 and 9 hertz. There is no proven regular emanating frequency of sound from the Earth which is in sufficient amplitude to make the pyramid resonate. There's absolutely no evidence for this in any Egyptian text or inscription, and there is no evidence for this in general scientifically. The Earth does actually have various interesting and low-frequency sounds based on geography. Right before an earthquake, for example, it's theorized that ELF waves will sometimes frighten animals, but this is only as common an occurrence as an earthquake. These sounds certainly don't form a perfect F-sharp chord either. That would mean that the Earth would have to have 3 resonant frequencies, meaning 3 unchanging structures which affected the entire planet at the same time. And no such structures have ever been discovered or recorded, and no such tones have ever been proven. I would welcome anyone to disprove this with direct evidence gained through experimentation. If in fact it is true, it should be as obvious as the nose on the Earth's face, or as obvious as its absence. I haven't seen any compelling evidence that any structure in the pyramid resonates at the frequency of an F-sharp chord, either because an F-sharp chord is a combination of 3 separate frequencies. Now, the wave is ugly. It would be odd for the resonant frequency of a structure to be excited by a wave like this. You can test this theory for yourself if you don't take my word for it. Take 3 tuning forks, F-sharp, A-sharp, and C-sharp, and stick them in the ground. See if they resonate together or even individually enough to be heard. I will be interested to see the results of this experiment. 12. But can't you collect microwave energy at the exact resonance frequency of hydrogen, creating a maser in the king's chamber and using the shaft leading into it as a waveguide? And doesn't this prove that hydrogen had to be there to create a stimulated emission? Dunn says explicitly that the microwave input source for this maser would be provided by, and I quote, the universe. Well, test this, if you can. Build a waveguide of the exact dimensions of the shaft he supposed was meant to be one, and see if the universe will even flip you enough microwave energy for one frozen burrito. It won't. And that's my prediction of the result. That's not how microwaves work. The intensity of surface-level microwaves on the Earth is way too small to really affect anything like that, much less provide a specific microwave frequency capable of exciting hydrogen into coherence. That's why they have to build such huge telescope apertures to study them. I don't need to prove this, however. The exceptional claim here is that the universe, whatever that means, will simply provide free microwave energy as long as you have a properly dimensioned shaft pointed at the sky. I wish the people at SETI would have told us this by now. Masers don't just require microwave energy, by the way. They require a lot more parts that we have absolutely no evidence for, and nor have we ever. We have a stone room with a sarcophagus and another stone room with evidence of gypsum from the mortar and salt from limestone, breath and flood water, and a strong toilet smell. And to suggest a more elegant explanation to connect those pieces of evidence would require an immense amount of additional evidence that just doesn't exist. Look at this diagram for a moment. You can see the difference between what a maser needs to function and what is provided. Was the evidence for such structures simply hidden or suppressed? Well, we have no evidence of that either. It's complete speculation. All we have is a hypothesis which has little to no supporting evidence and a mountain of evidence against it. If you speculate that these parts ever existed in the King's Chamber, you are speculating to an extent which borders on science fiction and is completely unsupported by existing structures or any structures we have evidence for. I would like to see Dunn build this machine using only what we have evidence for, but almost nothing of what he says is experimentally verified. It's all speculation and reasoning by analogy. 13. Okay, but if it was true, could you use a hydrogen maser to energize the ionosphere and transmit electricity? Now, this is the saddest myth associated with Tesla, and it undoes the rest of the entire Giza power plant myth. In my initial studies of Tesla, before I got to his later work, I tried to test out the idea of ionic channels and atmospheric transmission. I scientifically verified that the conductivity of air does in fact increase as air pressure decreases. So here's a video of that experiment. I also scientifically verified that a rising column of ions connected to an alternating power source could, in fact, create a plasma channel to an electrically conductive medium above it. Then I discovered after experimentation that it didn't work in any way which would be commercially viable for the same reasons Tesla did. Tesla discovered this too the same way I did. In 1935, in the new art of projecting concentrated non-dispersive energy through natural media, Tesla wrote, "I have contemplated the possibility of transmitting high-tension currents on the order of 20 million volts over a narrow beam of radiant energy, ionizing the air and rendering it in measure conductive. After preliminary laboratory experiments, I made tests on a large scale with the transmitter referred to in Colorado Springs and a beam of ultraviolet rays of great energy in an attempt to conduct the current to the high rarefied strata of the air and thus create an auroral such as might be utilized for illumination, especially of oceans at night. I found that there was some virtue in the principle, but the results did not justify the hope of important practical applications. Conduction is nice in a wire. The energy is largely conserved. Conduction in plasma, especially in terrestrial plasma like lightning for example, is subject to immense counterforces like radiation and convection. I discovered, as did Tesla, that convection bleeds off so much energy it makes the plasma so unstable that the idea of transmitting energy through the ionosphere would be as lossy as pouring water into a bottomless hole. It doesn't work. Not to mention, plasma of that magnitude is really, really hot. Turning the ionosphere into plasma might bake the Earth. At the very least, it would make air travel impossible because the convection currents would likely create hurricanes, tornadoes, or some other wind phenomena that generally would destroy everything they were trying to power. Convection is why I had to keep turning the power on and off to reestablish my own plasma arc. It takes power in the form of heat from the column so fast that it can't be replaced before it disappears. It just pops like an energy balloon. Now, not to mention the other thing which indicated that Mr. Dunn may not necessarily have known what he was talking about was that Tesla's system required at least 2 stations to establish ionospheric transmission in theory. There had to be an alternating current passed between 2 beams heading into the sky which initiated the transfer between the 2 stations. That's why in his patent there were 2 transmitters between tubes of rarefied air that had to be used. One maser beam would do nothing. And if there was more than one of these devices, where was the other, and can it be proven to be contemporary with the Giza Pyramid? Also, the maser beam he supposes is at a profound angle, not straight up and down. This is the absolute death knell of the idea as far as my own experimentation goes. Even lightning goes straight up and down, and the reason is that convection would instantly render any established conducting path at such an angle completely inoperable. You would end up with a Jacob's ladder, basically. Straight up and down was hard enough. Now imagine the force of convection is dragging the heat straight upward from an almost horizontal beam. It's why Tesla's machine was a purely vertical beam, and why mine was, and even then, neither worked for very long. Tesla abandoned the concept. The entire theory is built upon a machine which didn't exist and has been exhaustively proven to not be able to work by the person who they said based their idea on it. I guess Dunn didn't read far enough or do the work experimentally. 14. But aren't there pictures of light bulbs on Egyptian reliefs? No. Beneath the temple of Hathor at Dendera, there are inscriptions depicting a bulb-like object, which some have suggested is reminiscent of a Crookes tube, which is an early light bulb. Inside the bulbs, a snake forms a wavy line from a lotus flower, the quote-unquote socket of the bulb. A quote-unquote wire leads to a small box on which the air god is kneeling, and besides the bulb, there stands a two-armed jed pillar, which is connected to the snake and a baboon bearing two knives. Krasa and Hayback described the site in their book Light for the Pharaoh. They said, "The walls are decorated with human figures next to bulb-like objects reminiscent of oversized light bulbs. Inside these bulbs there are snakes in wavy lines, and the snakes' pointed tails issue from a lotus flower which, without much imagination, can be interpreted as the socket of the bulb. Something similar to a wire leads to a small box on which the air god is kneeling. Adjacent to it stands a two-armed jed pillar as a symbol of power which is connected to the snake. Also remarkable is the baboon-like demon holding two knives in his hands, which are interpreted as a protective and defensive power." Author Hayback goes even further in claiming that Egyptologists are completely useless for deciphering their own reliefs, since because of the lack of technical training, they could not recognize a light bulb when standing right before one. Literally, an Egyptologist may be a specialist in this area, he wrote, but is he able to detect electro-technical knowledge in old texts and pictures? Hardly. He would probably never come to the thought because schoolbook science anyhow categorically excludes this possibility. Frank Dornenberg, author of the website Mysteries of the Past, from whom I took a lot of this information, informs us that Dr. Whitekus, the Egyptologist who translated the Dendera texts and opposed their electrothesis, is not only an Egyptologist but also a diplomaed physicist, and he sees nothing technical in these reliefs. If you visit the site, you'll find an exhaustive breakdown of the reliefs, which thoroughly explains them in religious context and entirely eliminates any possibility we're talking about light bulbs. These texts all have writing on them, and the writing tells you exactly what they are. Let's start here. Here, Rasamtus rises from a lotus flower, like in the quote-unquote lamps, and this is the symbol for the creation of the universe, where the sun god Re rises as a serpent from a lotus blossom. Rasamtus is here in the role of Khepre, the god of the young sun. Also, he is equalized with Horus, a sun god from the earliest times of Egypt. Verse 4 deals with the lamp section. Rasamtus turns into Ihi, the god of musicians, and stands on the left of the lamp scene. There, a date is mentioned when the lamp, quote-unquote, is switched on, or what is really to be seen here, the sunrise on the new moon day in the last month of the flowering season in our calendar at the end of January. A lamp that is used on one day of a year. Very inefficient. Now, we're coming to the interesting section, the text about the lamp, and it reads, Harsumtus the child. Harsumtus the child, the son of Hathor, the beautiful child of the Golden One, the lord of making music for his mother, the eye of Re who is loved from the big nine when she sees him, he who is in the image of Reharakte, the splendid child of whose name is hidden. You shine with the snake on your forehead in the land of Dendera, because N, did, and was are determined to protect you. You rule both lands when you are justified before the tribunal, and the legacy of Re is under your supervision. This text is labeled as having been spoken by Harsumtus on the left of the bulb with the rattles in his hand. He has himself transformed into Ihi the Clean, as was told in the Bandau text, So we have another Ihi who is not a light bulb. He is talking to the person behind the light bulb with the snake on the forehead. This is usually worn by a pharaoh, therefore it is assumed that this is Ptolemaeus the 12th. Did and N are, as mentioned on the page before, Nehen and Jed time, and Wuz is the scepter of a pharaoh. We can see it on the right in the hands of the person in the shrine. Now further, reading on, Harsumtus. Harsumtus, the great god who is in Dendera, who rises from the lotus flower as living Ba, whose perfection is risen by the images of his Ka, whose image is worshipped by the crew of the day barge, whose body is carried by the pillar. Below his image, the primeval beginner Hathor sits, and whose mystery is carried by the companions of his Ka. This is the description of the lamp scene in the hieroglyphics written right next to it. The snake is Harsumtus, his body is carried by the Jed pillar, which is carried by the day barge. Therefore, the cable is identified as a boat, a reed float when we take the color of it in the color images into account, and the Egyptians believed that the sun was actually carried on the day barge across the sky during the day. His perfection, or majesty, i.e. the bulb, is carried by the statues of his Ka, too, because Harsumtus also appears twice as snake and as Ihi. The description of the bulb scene isn't complete totally. The missing parts are mentioned on the other wall, and the last lines of the inscriptions explain the two persons from the right of the bulb, and they read, Upu. Your name is perfect as Upu. Your face is that of a toad. I have killed your enemies with knives, and I fell your opponents at the place of execution. And Harsumtus. Harsumtus, the great god who is in Dendera in a secret form, who is protected in his shrine. If you look into this temple, you will see that the inscriptions have been exhaustively translated by someone with a PhD in physics. And they will surely prove to anyone who reads them and then researches further connections with other monuments in written Egyptian religion that we aren't talking about light bulbs. The surest sign that such bulbs didn't exist need not be proven by these writings or anything at all, in fact. An exceptional claim is that ancient Egypt had electric light, which would require an exceptional proof. The surest sign that these bulbs are pure conjecture is that they've never been found. You can make a light bulb that looks like the sun, but that doesn't mean the sun is a light bulb. This is, again, reasoning by analogy rather than making a scientific case for something. Scientific proof requires, well, proof. Where are the broken bulbs? Where are the wires? Where are the lighting sockets placed in tombs or even temples? Now, one would think that they would be everywhere because light bulbs burn out and become trash. We have 4,000 years of Egyptian monuments which are dated, studied, and whose inscriptions have been read, and there's not one actual mention of a light bulb. There's no electrical substructure, and there's absolutely no burned-out light bulbs. There are no light bulbs in ancient Egypt. Making one now to try and prove that they had one only proves that we have light bulbs that look like walls in ancient Egyptian tombs and proves nothing about ancient Egypt. 15. If the pyramid isn't a power plant, then why haven't we found any artifacts, a mummy, or inscriptions in it? In the case of the Great Pyramid, the reasons are simple. First of all, why would you carve an inscription on the granite walls of a tomb when you could just plaster them and write on the plaster? Plaster walls are to be found in many, many tombs because it was easier than chiseling out and trying to paint stone, which doesn't hold paint very well. It also means that you have to make the walls plaster flat, which kind of saves time and money because making granite plaster flat is not easy. Plaster walls, especially when exposed to moisture and constant travel, break down in just a few years. Would they last for 4,000? Well, not to mention that taking a piece of the walls might also get you some money, so why not? The lack of artifacts and the lack of wall dressing is really evidence of serious looting when you compare it to other tombs which are very, very similar in construction. Anything of value would have been long ago taken and perhaps even melted down for gold during times when ancient Egyptian artifacts were of no value because no one knew what they were. Now, the gems and gold would have had value in any time. We have copious amounts of written accounts of people doing this in our time. Imagine how many have come before and when they actually knew how to get into the thing without digging. Not only do we have strong evidence that the tomb would have been appointed as richly as any king could ever have hoped for given the wealth of the tombs we have preceding the Great Pyramid, there are decorations on the walls of other pyramids. For example, the Pyramid of Djoser was found to have lovely wall tiles meant to imitate the reed mats from his palace and make him more comfy in the afterlife. One suite of rooms was designed as a palace for the king's Ka to enjoy in the afterlife. The decoration of the walls is intended to look like a real structure and includes carved windows and doors. Called the Blue Chamber, the space is covered in thousands of molded blue-green faience tiles. and no fewer than 36,000 were discovered in the complex, arranged and set in panels to mimic a building technique using reed matting that is known as wattle and daub. The blue-green color was not only brilliant, but held regenerative symbolism connected to life-giving primeval waters. The color was also a visual allusion to the idyllic and symbolically potent field of reeds. This space was mentioned in later royal mortuary texts along with the earth and sky as domains the king was to receive in the afterlife. Interspersed with these dazzling blue sections on one wall were 3 large relief panels carved in limestone showing the king engaged in ritual actions. Some of these panels, like their parallels under the south tomb, depict the king performing in the ritual race around the boundary stones that would have taken place in the south court. These reliefs were never intended to be seen by the living, but instead provided a form of perpetual communication between the king and the gods, where he continuously performs perfect rituals designed to renew him. Egypt and the cosmos itself were renewed by these rituals. You can see these writings even today. They essentially say, however, this is a tomb. But why no mummies? Well, the Great Pyramid is a very visible landmark and a very visible cemetery full of rich dead people. It has been more or less looted constantly since before the time of Christ. After the age of the pyramids, there was a dark age in ancient Egypt, and you can find more information about this in a documentary with Joanne Fletcher called The Darkest Years of Ancient Egypt, available on YouTube. Egypt began to starve after the Pyramid Age was over due to changes in climate. And remember that they were dependent on the Nile. If the Nile failed them, the pharaoh who was supposed to be the god that ensured such things didn't happen would lose an awful lot of credibility. If you're starving, and there are huge buildings full of gold across the river from you, you go to the buildings and you take what's there to eat with it. And most likely the priests of the temple smelled the scent of trouble and relocated the mummies to protect them. This has happened many times in Egyptian history during either times of famine or upheaval or after a specific ruler fell out of favor. One of the most personal insults they could offer to an offending person after death was to destroy their mummy or chisel their name off of every monument. This is like an afterlife assassination to those who practice the religion of ancient Egypt. This happened to Queen Hatshepsut, for example, and her body had to be moved to protect her by the priests of her cult. A great example of this on a large scale would be the royal cache, known as TT320, an ancient Egyptian tomb located next to Deir el-Bahri in the Theban necropolis opposite the modern city of Luxor. It contains an extraordinary collection of mummified remains and funeral equipment of more than 50 kings, queens, and other royal family members of the New Kingdom, as it was used as a cache for royal mummies during the 21st dynasty. The 11 pharaohs found there include 1 of the 9 pharaohs from the 17th dynasty, 5 of the 15 pharaohs from the 18th dynasty, 3 of the 8 pharaohs from the 19th dynasty, and 2 of the 10 pharaohs from the 20th dynasty. The tomb was originally used as last resting place of the high priest Amun-Pinagem II and his wife Nesikons, as well as other close family members. Pinagem II died around 969 BCE in a time of decline of the Egyptian kingdom, during which mummies from former dynasties were vulnerable to grave robbery. So there's evidence that the mummies did get moved during bad times. Again, when things got bad and they couldn't stop the people from plundering the tombs of the dead and essentially destroying the living spirit in the afterlife to trade their funerary appointments for food now, they moved the mummy. Now, who knows where the mummy of Khufu is, but even if we haven't found it, the likelihood, given strong archaeological evidence, is that it was taken from the chamber, because there's a big stone sarcophagus there, which he was most likely buried in, which has no cover and a huge chunk taken out of it that looks like that might have been what was required to get the cover off. This is the obvious answer, and it would require exceptional evidence to prove anything more elegant than that. 16. So if the pyramid isn't a power plant made by aliens or ancient civilizations, or even the Egyptians themselves, then what the heck is it? It's a tomb. Certainly it is. By virtue of ancient Egyptian religion, it is a machine of sorts, a resurrection machine, a place of ascension. At this point in history, however, it's just an empty tomb. If this is not proven by the wealth of evidence I've presented, or which is available, then I don't know what would prove it. But it makes sense that even after all this, one might reject the obvious and replace it with a preconceived notion, because that's what the originator of the power plant theory did. The power plant theory has been posited as truth with a simple mantra. On page 123, paragraph 2, Dunn states, "In proposing my theory that the Great Pyramid is a power plant, I am not adamantly adhering to any one proposition. The possibilities may be numerous. Dunn has taken his proposition, adamantly adhered to it, and assumed no matter what anyone told him that there was only one possibility. He has overlaid his insisted upon conclusion onto already well-established narratives, seeing only what he wants to, and implying that those who study the subject are bold-faced liars, hiding things for their own gain. He has used incredibly thin and non-related evidentiary material as absolute confirmation of this proposition without even beginning to consider other explanations which didn't require unprovable and non-falsifiable ancient high-technology civilizations, alien interference, or the complete destruction of all the civilizations on Earth in a grand cataclysm to destroy the evidence that he's right. He firmly believed, despite the intrusive reality of actual facts, that only he knows what the pyramid was really for, he and Tesla,